When people hear the word cult, they usually think of something small, obscure. Maybe some isolated group on the fringes of society, worshiping a self-proclaimed prophet in a bunker somewhere. But the reality is, the line between a cult and a major religion is mostly scale, not substance. Strip away the rituals, the cathedrals, the centuries of art and architecture, and what you often find underneath is a deeply tribal psychology. A mindset built around obedience, conformity, unquestioned authority, and fear of dissent. And no one wants to believe they're part of a cult. That word feels too extreme, too embarrassing, something that happens to other people, weaker people, not to us, or the people we grew up with. But that's exactly how these systems maintain control. They don't present themselves as manipulative. They present themselves as sacred. The more we study how cults operate, psychologically, socially, structurally, the more uncomfortable similarities start to appear. Repetition of mantras, isolation from opposing views, blind loyalty to a leader or doctrine, strict boundaries between believers and non-believers, guilt, shame, and fear as tools of control. Now, of course, not every person who's religious is trapped in a cult. Many live perfectly normal lives, make their own decisions, and don't treat outsiders with hostility. But when you look at the structure of organized religion itself, the way it functions across time and geography, it starts to look eerily familiar to the patterns we associate with high suppression groups. Let's start with one of the core traits of any cult: thought control. This isn't just about being told what to believe, it's about being told how to think. You're not just taught that certain things are true, you're taught that questioning them is sinful, that doubt itself is dangerous. In many religious systems, asking the wrong questions can get you shunned. In history, it got people exiled or worse. The idea isn't just to convince you, it's to make disagreement feel impossible. In cult psychology, this is known as loaded language, where ordinary words take on special meanings and complex ideas get flattened into slogans. Think about how often believers are taught to distrust the world or the flesh or secular thinking, all vague negative phrases designed to steer people away from anything outside the bubble. And within that bubble, the sense of identity becomes deeply fused with belief. You're not just a person who practices a religion. You are that religion. So to question it feels like you're betraying your very self, your family, your culture, your purpose. That's how cults keep people in line, not through physical chains, but emotional ones. A lot of religions, especially the larger ones, also use a kind of social reinforcement that mimics cult dynamics. Groupthink becomes a survival tactic. You're part of a community that all thinks the same way, celebrates the same stories, condemns the same sins, and fears the same punishments. And it's not just about belief, it's about control over behavior, speech, even private thoughts. Ever felt the need to confess something you were only thinking? That's not morality. That's surveillance turned inward. What's more, these systems rarely admit doubt as a healthy part of growth. Instead, they brand it as weakness or temptation or the influence of something dark and external. They don't encourage critical thinking. They pathologize it. That's not how truth should work. If something is really true, it doesn't need to be protected from scrutiny. You don't need to threaten people with hell to make them believe in something real. That's not conviction. That's coercion. Then there's the issue of isolation. Cults isolate their members, sometimes physically, but more often emotionally and intellectually. They cut off outside influence, not just by creating an us versus them mindset, but by framing the outside world as dangerous, dirty, evil. Religions often do this too. Believers are told that non-believers are lost, wicked, or corrupted, that other worldviews are misguided or inspired by the devil, not because they've been reasoned through, but because they threaten the group's control. This isn't just rhetoric, it affects real lives. People raised in tightly religious environments often struggle to leave not just because of belief, but because of fear. Fear of losing their family, their friends, their support system. That's not faith, that's dependency. Another common cult feature is the infallible leader, someone who speaks for God or channels divine will. In organized religion, this takes many forms: prophets, popes, pastors, imams. But the pattern is the same. One person, or a hierarchy, speaks with unquestioned authority, and everyone else listens. And when abuse happens, as it often does in systems that concentrate power, it's swept under the rug or justified as a test of faith or blamed on the victim. The institution protects itself, not the people. That's how cults survive, through the denial of accountability. There's also a strong emphasis in both cults and religions on purity, keeping yourself pure from the corrupting influence of outsiders, avoiding sinful thoughts or people, following strict codes of dress, behavior, food, sex. These purity codes aren't just about tradition, they're tools of control. The more rules you have to follow, the more guilty you'll eventually feel. And the more guilt you feel, the easier you are to manipulate. Because guilt makes people obedient. When you feel like you're broken, you're more likely to submit to someone who says they can fix you. That's the psychological hook. You're told you're flawed by nature, and only the group, only the faith, can make you whole again. It's a classic psychological trap, and it works. Even more disturbing is how early it starts. In most cults, indoctrination begins as early as possible. Same with religion. Children are taught what to believe before they even understand how belief works, before they understand logic or evidence or their own minds. By the time they're old enough to ask questions, they already feel afraid. To question is to betray. To think critically is to sin. To leave is to destroy everything they love. This isn't just belief, this is programming. And what makes it even harder to walk away is how much emotional weight these beliefs carry. You're not just stepping away from a set of teachings, you're risking everything that gave your life meaning, community, identity, even your sense of morality. That's no small thing. And it's exactly why hierarchical groups build their systems this way. They wrap everything you are around what they say is true, so that pulling one thread feels like unraveling your entire life. And when someone does walk away, they're often met with exactly the kinds of reactions you'd expect from a cult: coldness, anger, threats, social exile, sometimes pity, sometimes rage, but rarely open dialogue. You see this in the way former believers are treated, as if leaving the religion means you've become dangerous or corrupted, that you're not just wrong, you're broken. That's not the behavior of a healthy community, that's the behavior of a hierarchy group protecting itself from collapse. A cult doesn't survive because it has the best ideas. It survives because it makes those ideas non-negotiable. An organized religion has had centuries to perfect that. It's not just about believing, it's about obedience. Deference to authority is baked into the system. Whether it's a holy book, a priest, or a prophet, the idea is the same. Don't trust yourself, trust the system. Trust what you're told. Even when it doesn't make sense, even when it contradicts itself, even when it harms people, especially when it harms people, because then the pain gets twisted into proof. You're suffering, that means you're being tested. You're doubting, that means you're under attack. You're questioning, that means you need more faith. It's a circular trap. And when the goal is obedience, not understanding, that trap becomes very effective. What's more, these systems often use love as a leash. The idea that God loves you unconditionally, but only if you follow the rules, only if you believe the right things, only if you stay loyal to the group. That's not unconditional love. That's manipulation dressed up as compassion. And it teaches people to fear the loss of love, to cling to it no matter how much it hurts. In cult psychology, this is called love bombing, overwhelming people with warmth and approval when they comply, and withdrawing it completely when they question or resist. You can see that dynamic in religious spaces too, especially in how converts are celebrated, and how dissenters are shunned. And this makes criticism incredibly difficult, because even mild disagreement feels like betrayal. You're not just doubting an idea, you're doubting something sacred. And that's how it's framed: sacred, untouchable, beyond question. But when something can't be questioned, it becomes dangerous, because power that isn't accountable will always abuse that lack of accountability. And we've seen it in every century, in every country. Religious institutions abusing power, covering up crimes, controlling education, silencing voices, shaping laws to reflect their own doctrines. And each time, the defense is the same: we are beyond reproach. We speak for God. To question us is to question truth itself. This isn't humility, this is authoritarianism dressed in holy clothes. In many ways, religion works as a kind of cultural immunity system. Anything that tries to attack it, even in a small way, gets pushed out immediately. Not with arguments, no worries, but with fear. And fear is a powerful motivator. It keeps people in their place long after they've stopped truly believing. Some stay because they don't want to disappoint their family. Others stay because they're afraid of hell. Some even stay because they've built their entire social world around belief, and stepping out would mean losing everyone. That's not the mark of a rational worldview, that's the mark of a psychological trap. And what's strange is how invisible it all becomes when it's normalized. If a small group in the woods said the world was ending, that their leader spoke for the divine, that outsiders were dangerous, and that only total obedience would save you, we'd call that a cult. But when millions believe the same thing, suddenly it's tradition, culture, sacred truth. The scale changes, but the structure stays the same, and we start to excuse behaviors that we'd never accept anywhere else. We allow faith leaders to claim moral authority while silencing victims. We give religious institutions tax exemptions and legal protections that shield them from accountability. We teach children stories filled with eternal damnation and blood sacrifice, and call that love? That's how deep this goes. And the more socially accepted a belief system becomes, the harder it is to criticize. People feel like they're attacking something good, something noble, something that gives people hope. And sure, for many people, religion does offer comfort. It gives structure, identity, meaning. But so do cults. That alone doesn't make something true or healthy. Comfort can coexist with control, and often does. So what separates a healthy belief system from a cult? It's not numbers. It's not age. It's not tradition. It's whether you're allowed to question, to leave without punishment, to disagree without being made to feel evil or broken or damned. It's whether power is shared or concentrated in the hands of a few who claim divine authority. It's whether guilt is used as a teaching tool, whether fear is baked into the foundation, and whether love is offered with strings attached. Many organized religions fail that test because their survival has depended on control over what people think, control over what they fear, control over who they trust, and over time that control becomes invisible. It's just the way things are. But when you step back, when you really start to look, it's not hard to see the cult psychology hidden in plain sight. Not in the individual believers, but in the structure that binds them. It's one thing to recognize these patterns in theory, but their real power lies in how they affect daily life, how they shape minds, limit choices, and condition people to accept control as comfort. Because that's the most subtle part of it all. When obedience stops feeling like submission and starts feeling like safety. When the group's rules become your internal voice. When someone doesn't need to monitor you because you've learned to monitor yourself. This internalized control is one of the most lasting effects of a high-demand system, and it's especially powerful when it starts in childhood. The beliefs become your lens for reality, your standard for truth, your moral compass, even if it points in directions you never chose. And that's the thing. You didn't choose, you were told. from the very beginning, and that makes people very loyal, not just to the belief, but to the identity that forms around it. It creates a version of selfhood that's deeply tied to approval, to being good in the eyes of the group. And so, many people live their whole lives trying to be what the system defines as good, even when it hurts them, even when it contradicts their own intuition. This is why so many people in religious environments stay silent when something feels wrong. They've been trained to distrust their own judgment and to defer to higher authority. Whether that's scripture or a pastor or just the collective voice of tradition, this can have serious consequences, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. Because when large populations are conditioned to obey without question, to treat dissent as evil, to see outsiders as dangerous, then those systems become obstacles to progress, to equality, to justice. They resist change not because they've reasoned through it, but because change feels like betrayal. And institutions that feel threatened by change often protect themselves in ways that aren't just irrational, but harmful. You can see this in how religious groups have responded to scientific discoveries over the centuries, from Galileo to Darwin to stem cell research. There's often a reflexive resistance, not because the facts are weak, but because the facts contradict the story. And when the story is sacred, facts become the enemy. You see it in how religious leaders have fought against civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, often using scripture as a shield for bigotry. Not always out of hatred, but out of fear. Because if one part of the doctrine can be questioned, then maybe the rest can too. And so the control must be reinforced, not just with sermons, but with shame, with guilt, with fear of eternal consequences. This is cult behavior scaled up to a global level. And again, this doesn't mean every believer is trapped in that mindset, but the structure is there and it rewards compliance far more than it rewards thought. And when people do think, when they do step outside, the reaction is often harsh. That's not a coincidence. That's how hierarchical systems defend themselves. By making it painful to leave. By making it lonely to think differently. By making obedience feel like love and independence feel like abandonment. But independence is not abandonment, and obedience is not love. Love doesn't require silence. Truth doesn't fear questions, and meaning that can only survive inside a cage isn't meaning at all. The tragedy is that so many people sense something is off. They feel the tension, the contradictions, the dissonance, but they suppress it because the cost of voicing doubt feels too high. They bury the questions because asking them risks everything. But questions don't disappear. They wait, and often all it takes is one moment. One contradiction too many, one injustice that can't be excused away, one flash of clarity that cuts through the fog. And the whole house of cards begins to wobble. That's where real change begins. Not in loud debates, but in quiet awakenings. In the late-night thoughts no one else hears. In the small, honest conversations people have when they think they're alone. That's when the system loses its grip. Because the system can't survive without fear. And once the fear breaks, even for a second, there's no going back. This is why so many ex-believers describe their departure not just as a rejection of doctrine, but as a recovery of self. They didn't just stop believing. They started thinking again, feeling again, trusting their own mind. That's what cults try to prevent. And that's why organized religion in its more extreme forms mirrors that same architecture. Because it needs loyalty, not curiosity. It needs obedience, not exploration. It needs you to stay small so it can stay big. But people outgrow cages, even ones they've lived in their whole lives. And the moment you stop fearing your questions, that's the moment the whole structure starts to crack. Not in a violent way, but in the quiet, persistent way that truth always works. That's what makes this topic so difficult and so important. We're not just talking about beliefs. We're talking about systems that shape how people think, feel, and live. We're talking about control disguised as purpose, obedience disguised as love, fear disguised as faith. And once you start seeing those disguises, you can't unsee them. You realize how deep it goes, how many people are trapped without realizing it, how many mistakes get excused in the name of something higher. You realize that manipulation doesn't need to be loud or obvious. It can wear a smile. It can come with rituals and candles and songs. It can look like tradition or community or peace. But if it requires your silence, if it punishes your questions, if it demands loyalty over truth, then it's not peace. It's pressure. And it's not community. It's conditioning. You don't need to hate something to outgrow it. You don't need to be angry to walk away. You just need to recognize when something is holding you back, when it's shaping your mind in ways you didn't choose. That recognition takes courage, because leaving a high-resource system means facing uncertainty. It means being okay with not having all the answers. But that's where freedom lives. Not in knowing everything, but in being allowed to find out. The cult doesn't want you to find out. It wants you to stay obedient, stay afraid, stay quiet. Religion, when it mirrors cult behavior, does the same. It tells you that your doubts are wrong, that your instincts are sinful, that your questions are dangerous, but they're not. They're the beginning of honesty, and the beginning of clarity, the beginning of being able to look at your life and say, this is mine, not borrowed, not inherited. And that matters, because a life lived in fear of punishment isn't a life, it's a performance, a script you didn't write. And you don't have to perform anymore. You can choose meaning that makes sense to you. You can find morality that doesn't rely on threats. You can build identity from honesty, not obedience. That's not a rejection of purpose. It's the start of one, and it's not easy, but it's real. And that's enough, more than enough. Because freedom, real freedom, doesn't come from permission. It comes from the moment you stop asking for it and start claiming it quietly, clearly, and completely